It was a sunny afternoon when a young black girl and her white father made a quick stop at a rest area along the highway. The family had been driving for hours, traveling to visit relatives, and they decided it was time to take a break. The father, a man in his late 30s, was looking forward to stretching his legs, while his daughter, a 10-year-old girl with a big smile, was ready to grab a snack and enjoy the little break. The rest area was busy with other travelers taking their own breaks. Cars were parked along the lot, and a few families stood outside stretching or grabbing food from their cars. The young girl wore a bright yellow raincoat, her braids bouncing as she skipped ahead of her father toward a picnic table. The father followed closely behind, chatting with his daughter and laughing as they walked. They took a seat at a picnic table underneath a small pavilion. The father opened a bag of chips, offering some to his daughter, who politely declined. She didn't seem very interested in the snack, and instead, she gazed out over the parking lot, watching people come and go. The father, not noticing his daughter's distracted behavior, happily munched on his chips. As they sat there, enjoying the break, a man in his early 40s sat down at a nearby table, sipping coffee from a travel mug. He was dressed in a plain shirt and jeans, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the area. He had been a Marine for several years and knew how to observe his surroundings. He had learned the importance of noticing things that others might miss. It was then that he noticed the young girl. The Marine's attention was immediately drawn to her. There was nothing particularly strange about her appearance, but there was something about her body language that caught his eye. The girl was sitting stiffly, her gaze darting from one direction to another, avoiding direct eye contact with her father. She seemed uneasy, as if something was wrong, yet she didn't say anything. The Marine kept his distance, watching carefully, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he observed the girl, he noticed something even more unsettling. The young girl subtly raised her hand to her mouth and made a small, deliberate gesture. It wasn't something he had seen before, but it reminded him of a signal, one he had learned during his time in the military. A signal that meant someone was in trouble and needed help. The gesture was brief, but the Marine had no doubt that it was a call for help. He was trained to recognize signs of distress, especially in situations where a child might be in danger. The Marine's heart began to race as he thought about the possibilities. He quickly looked at the father, who seemed completely unaware of his daughter's discomfort. The man continued to eat his chips, chatting away without noticing the tension in the girl's posture or the fear in her eyes. The Marine knew he had to act. He couldn't ignore what he had seen, and he couldn't risk leaving the situation to chance. His instincts told him that the girl might be in danger. But how should he approach it? What if he was wrong? What if he misread the situation? But his gut told him he wasn't. He had seen enough to recognize the signs of distress, and he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. As he stood up from his table, he debated how to handle the situation. Should he call the authorities? Should he approach the girl directly? The questions raced through his mind, but he knew he couldn't ignore what was happening in front of him. He took a deep breath, made up his mind, and walked toward the picnic table where the father and daughter were sitting. As the Marine walked slowly toward the picnic table, his thoughts were racing. He couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. The young girl's subtle SOS gesture had stuck with him, and he knew he couldn't just walk away from the situation without making sure everything was okay. He took a quick look around the rest area. It was busy, but not overwhelmingly so. Several families were scattered throughout, some chatting, others sitting quietly, taking their breaks. He noticed a few other individuals who were minding their own business. Nothing seemed unusual, except for the odd discomfort he had noticed in the girl. The Marine knew that approaching the father and daughter directly was the best option. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he couldn't let this moment slip by. He felt a strong sense of responsibility, as if he were still serving in the military, needing to protect and ensure everyone's safety. As he got closer to the table, the father didn't seem to notice him at first. He was still eating his chips and chatting with his daughter. The girl, however, had a slightly anxious look on her face. She was still staring at the parking lot, her small hands clutching her jacket sleeves tightly. The Marine could see her fidgeting, a small but unmistakable sign of worry. "Excuse me, sir," the Marine said gently, trying not to startle the father. He had learned the importance of calmness and respect when interacting with people. The father turned his head, slightly surprised, but smiled politely. "Yes, can I help you?" the father asked, his tone friendly but slightly distracted. "I couldn't help but notice that your daughter seems a bit unsettled. Is everything okay?" the Marine asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. He didn't want to overstep, but he couldn't ignore his instincts. The father glanced at his daughter, who quickly looked down, avoiding his gaze. He didn't immediately understand what the Marine was implying. "She's fine," he replied, his voice casual. "She's just a little shy, that's all. Nothing to worry about." The Marine studied the father's face for a moment. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation, or maybe he didn't want to. But the Marine wasn't convinced. He could sense something deeper, a feeling that lingered in the air. There was more to this than just a shy girl. "I know it's a strange question," the Marine continued, "but I've been trained to notice signs of distress. And when I saw your daughter make that gesture, it seemed like a sign that someone might be in trouble." The father's face changed just slightly, a hint of confusion crossing his expression. He glanced down at his daughter, who was still avoiding eye contact, her hands now fidgeting nervously. The Marine could see the shift, the quiet tension that now hung between them. "I'm just trying to help," the Marine said softly, trying to reassure the father. "It's okay if everything is fine, but sometimes it helps to ask." For a moment, there was silence. The father seemed to be processing the words, unsure of how to respond. He looked at his daughter, who was now nervously biting her lip. The Marine noticed the change in her demeanor, the way she seemed to shrink under her father's gaze. Something wasn't right, and the Marine couldn't let it go. "Look," the father said, his voice a little more serious now. "She's fine. We've been on the road for hours. She's just tired." The Marine nodded, but he wasn't convinced. "If you're sure," he said, still keeping a watchful eye on the girl. He gave a polite nod and took a step back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As the Marine walked away, he couldn't help but glance back at the picnic table. The father and daughter were still sitting there, but the Marine's instincts told him that this was far from over. He had seen enough to know that there was something more to this story, something the father wasn't sharing. The Marine knew he couldn't just let this situation go. He needed to make sure the girl was safe, and if something was wrong, he would be ready to take action. He glanced back toward the parked police car and made a quick decision. With a sense of purpose in his stride, the Marine walked back toward the rest area's entrance, determined to find help and uncover the truth. Something wasn't right, and he wasn't about to leave until he was certain the young girl was safe. As the Marine walked away, he kept his eyes on the family, not wanting to appear too obvious, but feeling a growing sense of unease. His instincts told him that something wasn't quite right, despite the father's calm demeanor. The little girl's nervousness, her repeated gestures, and the way she refused to make eye contact with her father had unsettled him. It was then that he decided he couldn't just walk away without being sure that everything was fine. The girl's subtle SOS signal, combined with the father's dismissive response, raised a red flag in his mind. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he wasn't willing to ignore it either. The Marine stopped in his tracks and thought for a moment. Should he call the police? Should he intervene further? He didn't want to make the father feel accused or embarrassed, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something needed to be done. After all, it was his duty to protect those in need, especially when something wasn't adding up. He decided to take a step back and observe. From his position, he could see the family more clearly. The little girl still looked uncomfortable, even though her father seemed content and unfazed. Her hands were gripping the edge of her seat tightly, her legs bouncing nervously. The father continued talking to her, but she barely responded, her eyes fixed on the ground. There was no way he could just ignore this anymore. The Marine knew that sometimes people were unaware of the signs they were giving off. They didn't realize how others might interpret them. But this situation felt different. There was something deeper going on, something the Marine couldn't pinpoint. His training had taught him to read between the lines, to look for the small things that others might overlook. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that his role wasn't just to be a bystander. He needed to act. After a few moments of quiet observation, he noticed the girl glance up at him. She caught his gaze for just a second, and in that brief moment, the Marine saw fear in her eyes. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of something desperate, a plea for help, even if she couldn't say the words herself. The Marine took another deep breath and walked back toward the family. This time, he was determined to get to the bottom of the situation. As he approached, he felt his heart rate pick up, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "Excuse me," he said to the father, who looked up, surprised by his return. "Yeah, is something wrong?" the father asked, his voice a little more defensive than before. The Marine nodded slowly. "I can't shake the feeling that something's going on here. I saw your daughter make a gesture earlier, one that signals distress. I just want to make sure she's okay." The father's eyes widened. His posture stiffened, and the Marine could sense the tension building. "She's fine," he said quickly, his voice becoming more guarded. "You're overthinking things. She's just tired. We've been traveling for a long time." The Marine wasn't convinced. The girl's expression told a different story. He could feel that she was silently begging for help, and it was hard to ignore the feeling that the father wasn't being fully honest with him. "I don't mean to intrude," the Marine said calmly, trying to remain non-confrontational. "But as I said, I'm trained to recognize signs of distress, and when I saw her signal, I couldn't just walk away. If everything's truly okay, I'll leave you both to it. But I need to know for sure." The father shifted uncomfortably, clearly frustrated by the continued questioning. The girl, still avoiding eye contact, kept her gaze down. The Marine's gut told him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something deeper was happening, and he couldn't ignore it. He wasn't going to leave until he knew the girl was safe. He turned and looked toward the police car parked in the distance, feeling more determined than ever to get the authorities involved if necessary. "I'll be right back," the Marine said, his voice steady. "I'm going to call for help, just to make sure everything's all right. You can stay here with your daughter." The Marine didn't wait for a response. He knew that sometimes the only way to protect someone was to step in, even when others tried to downplay the situation. His job wasn't to let this go, no matter how uncomfortable it made the father. With a quick but firm step, he made his way toward the police car. The situation wasn't over, and as the Marine walked toward the police officers, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered a hidden story, one that needed to be addressed before it was too late. As the Marine walked towards the police car, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. His steps were quick but measured, and as he approached the officers, his mind raced with thoughts of the little girl and her father. What was going on? Why had the girl made that SOS gesture? The Marine had seen that sign before, in training, but never in real life. He had learned that it was a universal distress signal, often used when someone needed help but couldn't speak it aloud. He reached the car and stopped just a few feet from the officers. The cop sitting inside the vehicle glanced at him, sensing something urgent in the Marine's expression. "Something's not right, officer," the Marine said, keeping his voice low but firm. "There's a child in danger, and I need your help." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden seriousness of the Marine's tone. "What do you mean?" the officer asked, his hand resting on the steering wheel. "I was just at that rest stop," the Marine said, gesturing toward the family sitting at the table. "I saw the father with his daughter. The girl made an SOS gesture, and I'm pretty sure she was trying to signal for help. She's scared, and her father, he didn't seem to notice." The officer nodded, but his expression was skeptical. "You're saying the girl's in trouble, but there's no clear sign of anything happening, right? The father's with her. The Marine shook his head. I'm telling you, something's wrong. I've been trained to notice these things. She's nervous, she's scared, and the father's too calm. It's not adding up. We need to check it out. The officer seemed to hesitate, still unsure whether it was really something worth investigating. But the Marine's seriousness was contagious, and soon the officer began to nod slowly, coming to the same conclusion. All right, the officer said, let's go and talk to them. The Marine led the officer back to the family. As they walked toward the table, the Marine felt the weight of his decision. He knew that confronting the father might cause trouble, but he couldn't ignore the look on the little girl's face. They reached the table, and the father's eyes flicked up, his expression turning cautious when he saw the officer. Everything all right here? The officer asked, his voice neutral, but his eyes scanning the situation. The father gave a tight smile, clearly uneasy. Yeah, everything's fine, he said quickly. Just a little rest before we get back on the road. The Marine watched the father carefully, but his gaze kept flicking to the little girl. She was still avoiding eye contact, her small hands tightly clutching the edge of the table, her posture tense. The Marine could tell she was frightened, but he also noticed something else, a slight shift in her eyes as she looked at him. It was subtle, but there was hope in her eyes, a silent plea that he couldn't ignore. The officer seemed to sense the tension too. We're just making sure everything's all right, the officer said, his voice more casual, but with a hint of authority. This is just a standard check. The father shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but his smile remained pasted on his face. Everything's fine, he repeated, this time with a little more force in his tone. The Marine stood by, watching the father closely. He had dealt with situations like this before. His training had taught him that sometimes people were good at hiding things, especially when they were scared of getting caught. He had no idea what was happening here, but the girl's distress was undeniable. The officer took another step closer to the family, his eyes flicking between the father and daughter. We're just going to ask her a few questions. Is that all right? The father hesitated, and the Marine saw the nervousness in his eyes. For a brief moment, the father seemed like he was going to protest, but then he just nodded stiffly, as though defeated. The officer turned to the little girl, who was still looking down at the table, her hands trembling slightly. Hey there, the officer said gently, crouching down to her level. Are you okay? Can you tell me if everything's all right? The little girl looked up at the officer, her eyes wide and filled with fear. It was clear she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, she gave him the same subtle SOS signal, just a small movement of her hands that no one else seemed to notice. The Marine felt his heart drop. He was right. The girl was trying to tell him something. And now, it was up to them to make sure she was safe. The officer crouched down beside the little girl, his expression softening. He knew something was wrong. The girl's small, trembling hands gave him a clear signal that she wasn't just nervous. She was trying to communicate something more important. His instincts told him to be cautious. There was something unsettling about the father, something off about the whole situation. Sweetheart, are you okay? The officer asked gently, trying to keep his voice calm and non-threatening. The little girl's wide eyes met his, filled with uncertainty, but her body language spoke volumes. She was scared, and she desperately needed help. The girl looked at her father briefly, then back at the officer. She hesitated for a long moment before slowly nodding her head. Her lips quivered, but she still didn't speak. Instead, she moved her hand again in a subtle gesture. The same SOS signal, just like the Marine had witnessed earlier. The officer looked up at the Marine, who stood nearby, watching intently. The Marine nodded subtly, confirming his suspicion. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. The girl's silence, her gesture, and her fear were all the evidence he needed. It was time to take action. Sir, the officer said to the father, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to ask your daughter a few more questions. This is a routine check. It's for her safety." The father stiffened, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't argue. He simply gave a tight nod. "She's fine. We're just stopping here for a break," he replied, his voice laced with tension. The officer turned back to the little girl, who still sat quietly, clutching the edge of the table. He took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment that would determine everything. "Sweetheart, I know you're scared, but you can trust us. We're here to help you." The girl glanced once more at her father, then back at the officer, before slowly opening her mouth. "He's not my daddy," she whispered, barely audible. The officer's heart sank. Those simple words were enough to send a shockwave through him. The girl's eyes were filled with a mix of fear and relief. Relief that someone was finally listening, but fear because her words might change everything. The officer immediately stood up, his mind racing. "Sir," he said to the father, his voice now harder, more commanding, "we need to speak with you for a moment." The father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "What's going on? I told you everything is fine," he snapped, but the officer could see the strain in his eyes. "We have reason to believe that something's not right," the officer said calmly, but firmly. "We're going to have to ask you to stay here while we investigate further." The father's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, it seemed like he might explode. But then he seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging as if the fight had left him. He didn't resist as the officer calmly guided him away from the table. Meanwhile, the Marine stayed by the little girl's side, offering her a reassuring smile. She was still shaking, but she now seemed to understand that someone was finally taking her seriously. He knelt down beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you want to tell me what's happening?" he asked quietly, his voice full of kindness and concern. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but something about his calm demeanor gave her the courage she needed. "He's not my daddy," she repeated, this time a little louder. "He's just pretending. He took me and my brother from the park. I want to go home." The Marine's heart broke as the truth began to unravel. The little girl had been abducted, and the man who had been pretending to be her father had likely been the one responsible. The girl's quiet bravery in giving the officer the signal had been a cry for help, and now the whole situation was beginning to make sense. The officer turned to the Marine, who gave him a quick nod. It was time to call for backup. There was no way this man was going to walk away free. The safety of this child was their priority, and they needed to act quickly before the situation escalated any further. "I need backup," the officer said into his radio, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got an abduction here." As the sound of police sirens echoed in the distance, the Marine looked at the little girl one last time. Her fear was still evident, but she was no longer alone. Someone was listening. Someone was acting, and soon she would be safe. In the midst of all the chaos, the girl finally allowed herself to let out a small sigh of relief. She wasn't alone anymore. Help had arrived. The air in the diner felt thick with tension. The officer stood tall beside the little girl, who now sat quietly with the Marine. Her small body shook with nervousness, but there was also a sense of relief that couldn't be ignored. She was finally being heard. Her SOS gesture had made all the difference. The father, who was still standing by the door, nervously kept his eyes on the officer. "Is there something you're not telling me?" the officer asked, his voice firm yet calm. He had seen this before, the fear in the child's eyes, the hesitation in her voice. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to manipulate a situation, but today was different. The father hesitated. His lips tightened as though he were trying to hold something back. The officer noticed his body language, tense and defensive. It wasn't just an innocent pause. The man was clearly struggling, and the officer needed to get to the truth quickly. The Marine, standing nearby, quietly watched the father. He had seen this kind of situation before, where the abductor tried to talk his way out of it. The man's eyes darted nervously from the officer to the little girl, but there was no denying it now. His act was falling apart. "I'm just taking her back to her family," the father said, his voice shaky but insistent. "I'm doing the right thing. She's my daughter. I was just trying to get her away from a bad situation." The officer narrowed his eyes. "She's not your daughter," he said with quiet certainty. "She told me herself. Now you can explain everything to me, or we'll have to do this the hard way." The father's expression faltered. He glanced quickly at the exit, clearly considering his options, but the officer wasn't giving him a chance to escape. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," the father said, suddenly defensive, "but I have every right to be with her. This is a misunderstanding." The officer shook his head, recognizing the familiar pattern. It was a story used by many who tried to hide their intentions, but the truth was already clear, and it was only a matter of time before the man's lies crumbled. "I'm sorry, but that's not going to work anymore," the officer replied firmly. "You're going to stay right here while we figure this out." The officer took out his phone, dialing in the details of the situation. He needed to alert the rest of the team. This wasn't just a lost child case. This was a serious situation. He couldn't let the man slip away. He watched the father's face, which had started to show signs of panic. That's when it clicked. The man knew he was caught. The Marine stepped forward, speaking softly to the girl. "You're doing great," he said, smiling gently. "Do you feel safe now?" The little girl nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek, though it was no longer one of fear. It was a tear of relief, of knowing that someone had finally listened to her and believed her. She had done the right thing. Meanwhile, the officer continued his phone call, relaying everything he had learned. "We have an abduction here. I need all available units at this location. This isn't just a simple case of a missing child. This is serious. I need help. Now." As the officer hung up, he turned to the Marine, his voice low. "We're going to need to secure this area. There's no telling what this man might do next." The father's eyes were darting around, clearly looking for a way out. The officer could see his pulse racing, but the officer was unrelenting. It wasn't just his duty. It was his responsibility to protect that little girl, and he wouldn't let the man escape. A few minutes later, the backup arrived. More officers entered the diner, securing the scene. They took control of the situation, moving swiftly and professionally. One of the officers approached the father, handcuffing him as the rest of the team gathered around. The man's protests were ignored. "Do you want to tell us where you were really taking her?" the officer asked, as another officer checked his bag for any belongings. There was no point in hiding anymore. The father finally collapsed, the weight of his deception overwhelming him. His voice faltered as he stammered. "I wasn't going to hurt her. I was just trying to." His voice trailed off as the officers continued their work. The Marine stood by the little girl, offering her a comforting smile. She had done the right thing, and she was safe now. They would make sure of it. As the backup officers took the father away, the little girl stood up, her small body trembling but more confident now. She had faced something terrifying and had come through. She had not just saved herself, but had found her courage in a moment of fear. The officer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said. And in that moment, the world seemed a little less scary for her. The police station was quiet when they arrived. The little girl, still holding the Marine's hand, walked through the doors with a new sense of calm. The chaos was over. She had been through something terrifying, but now she was safe. The officers moved with purpose, their professional demeanor giving the girl a sense of security. Her father, now in custody, was being questioned in another room. The truth about his actions had become undeniable. As the officers continued their investigation, they carefully reviewed the man's history and his intentions. The Marine who had stepped in to help the girl stayed by her side, not letting her feel alone. In the quiet room where the girl and Marine waited, the Marine sat beside her. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. The girl, still processing everything, nodded. "I'm okay now," she said, her voice small but strong. The weight of the situation was lifting from her shoulders, and the tears that had once filled her eyes now felt like distant memories. The officer who had taken charge of the scene entered the room. His face softened when he saw how the little girl was doing. "You did really well," he said, kneeling down to her level. "You helped us a lot today." The girl smiled shyly, her fingers playing with the hem of her jacket. "I'm just glad I'm not scared anymore," she said, her voice full of quiet courage. She had been terrified in the diner, unsure if anyone would believe her, but now, with everything behind her, she could breathe a little easier. "We're just glad you're safe," the officer said, standing up. "You did the right thing." As the officer and Marine spoke, the girl began to relax, her shoulders no longer tense with fear. For the first time that day, she felt a sense of peace. The officer's words echoed in her mind. "You did the right thing." And she knew that, no matter what, she had made the right choice by speaking up and doing what she could to get help. Outside the room, officers continued to work on the case. The man who had tried to deceive everyone was being held accountable for his actions. The little girl's bravery had turned the tide. Her SOS gesture had been seen, and because of it, the situation had been resolved before it escalated further. The child's mind wandered back to her father. She remembered the uncertainty and fear she had felt when he first took her in the car. At the time, she didn't know what he was planning. But now, with the truth coming out, it made sense. She could only hope that his punishment would be fair and just. After all, he had betrayed her trust, but she was grateful that through everything, she had remained safe. The Marine, sensing the change in her mood, leaned in slightly. "You're a strong kid," he said, his voice warm. "We're proud of you." The girl glanced up at him, her eyes wide with admiration. She had never thought of herself as brave. But now, sitting in the police station, surrounded by people who had worked hard to keep her safe, she realized just how much she had done. She had been brave when it mattered most. "I don't want to be scared anymore," she said, almost to herself. The Marine smiled. "You won't be," he reassured her. "You've proven today that no matter how tough things get, you can make it through." For the first time that day, the girl smiled, a real smile, as she realized the truth of his words. She had made it through something no child should ever have to go through, and she had done it with bravery, strength, and the willingness to stand up for herself. The officer gave her a final look, one of deep respect. "It's over now," he said. "You're safe." And though the world outside the police station may have been uncertain, the little girl knew that, for her, the worst was behind her. She had survived the darkness of that day, and now she had a chance to move forward, stronger and more confident than before. The officer stood up, and the Marine, too, offered her a gentle pat on the back. They would make sure she got home safely, back to her family, where she could begin to heal. It was over now, but her bravery would never be forgotten.